Welcome back to Mea Sententia. My name is Caroline, and I'm a PhD candidate in classical studies. Today we're talking about historical inaccuracies in the Odyssey. Nope, not that one. This one. Homer's Odyssey chronicles the journey of Odysseus as he makes his way home after the Trojan War. The events of the poem take place sometime around 1200 BCE, at the end of the Mycenaean Bronze Age. The Odyssey itself, however, wasn't composed during the Bronze Age. The poem as we have it today most likely took shape sometime in the late 8th or early 7th century during the Archaic period. That means we're looking at a gap of roughly 400 to 500 years. That's a lot of time in which the world can change. Just think about how different life is today from life during the Renaissance. So, when we talk about historical accuracy in adaptations of Homer, we need to ask a deceptively simple question. Accurate to when? This question has become particularly relevant amid some rather bad faith criticism surrounding Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. A certain tech oligarch, for example, vowed to use AI to make his own cinematic adaptation of the epic that would be both historically accurate and true to Homer's art. These goals, however, aren't really compatible. Historical accuracy and fidelity to the Homeric text are not the same thing. In fact, if you tried to make the Odyssey historically accurate to the Bronze Age, you would have to change quite a lot about Homer's original text. And no, I'm not talking about the sea monsters in Cyclopes. In some instances, Homer recalls a mythologized Mycenaean past in remarkably accurate detail, thanks in no small part to the preservation of cultural knowledge through oral tradition and material culture. The most famous example comes from the Iliad. During the Trojan War, Odysseus arms himself for a night raid against the Trojans and puts on a boar's tusk helmet. For a long time, scholars thought Homer's description of this helmet was essentially fictional. Then, archaeologists began finding actual Mycenaean helmets decorated with rows of boar's tusks. At the same time, there are many references within Homer's works that reflect the later Iron Age society of his own time. Let's look at 3 examples. Perhaps the most obvious anachronism in the Odyssey is the use of iron. Since the heroes of the Trojan War belong to the Bronze Age, their weapons and tools should primarily be made of bronze. Now, this doesn't mean that iron was completely unknown to Bronze Age civilizations, but it was much rarer and far less central to technological culture than it would become during the Iron Age. Chalkos, the ancient Greek word for bronze, does appear with greater frequency in the Odyssey than sideros, the word for iron. A quick search using the TLG, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, shows Chalkos appearing 57 times, while sideros appears 18 times. This shows that Homer is making a fair effort to anachronize the poem. However, if we look at specific examples in which iron appears, we can see Homer's contemporary world encroaching on the historiomythic past. For example, let's take a look at one of the most famous passages in the entire epic, the blinding of the Cyclops Polyphemus. Odysseus and his men sharpen and heat a massive wooden stake of olive wood. They drive it into the Cyclops' eye, and Homer describes the horrifying sound it makes using a simile. And as when a smith dips a great axe or an adze in cold water to temper it, and it makes a great hissing, for from this comes the strength of iron, so did his eye hiss round the stake of olive wood. It's quite an impactful comparison, but here's the thing. The simile only works if Homer's audience is familiar with the process of ironsmithing, which would have been unlikely for most people in Mycenaean Greece. And, as Alfred Heubeck points out in his 1989 commentary on the Odyssey, the specific technique described here wasn't even introduced in Greece until the 9th century. This is a pattern we're going to see again and again. The characters and events of Homer's epics may belong to the heroic past, but key details and descriptions surrounding them are often drawn from Homer's own time period. Such is the case when looking at women's fashion in the Odyssey. Female characters within the epic poem are consistently portrayed in post-Mycenaean attire. For example, they wear garments fastened with brooches known as fibulae. You can think of them as very fancy safety pins. In Book 18 of the Odyssey, one of Penelope's suitors offers her a beautifully embroidered robe fastened with a dozen golden brooches. This particular style of dress fastening first appears only in the latest stages of the Mycenaean period, and doesn't become typical until much later on. The closest parallels come from the late 8th or 7th century. And it isn't just the clothing, it's the jewelry too. Another suitor offers Penelope a pair of golden earrings decorated with 3 mulberry-shaped pendants. Oliver Dickinson has compared this description to a particular pair of earrings from the 9th century. Whether or not this is what Homer had in mind, the triple pendant design is quite different from the typical designs of Mycenaean earrings, which featured simpler hoops or spherical beads. We know this because of various artifacts found at grave sites, which brings us to our final example, burial customs. In both the Iliad and the Odyssey, cremation is presented as the normal and proper way to dispose of the dead. One of the clearest examples comes from Book 11 of the Odyssey, when Odysseus visits the underworld. There, he encounters the ghost of his fallen comrade Elpenor. And I mean fallen both in the literal and figurative sense. While on the island of Aiaia, Elpenor gets drunk, passes out on the roof of Circe's palace, and falls to his death. Because Odysseus and his men left in such a hurry, they failed to give him a proper burial. Elpenor therefore begs Odysseus to go back, burn his body, and perform the appropriate funerary rites. And Odysseus eventually does exactly that. If we go back to the Mycenaean Bronze Age, however, burial practices looked rather different. The primary method of burial for the Mycenaeans was inhumation, in shaft graves, chamber tombs, or monumental tholos tombs, sometimes called beehive tombs. So, here again, Homer's supposedly Bronze Age heroes are practicing a burial custom that fits much better with later Greek society. These are only 3 examples of anachronisms in the Odyssey. There are plenty more. Homer's world is a fascinating mixture of different historical periods, a literary construction built on layers of cultural memory. Some elements reach far back into the Bronze Age, while others reflect the 8th century world in which the poem was composed. So, when someone says that an adaptation of Homer needs to be historically accurate, the first question should probably be, accurate to which historical period? The Mycenaean Bronze Age? The 8th century? Or the strange composite world that Homer created? If you'd like to dig deeper, I've included a bibliography and the specific Homeric passages I referenced down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. It tells the algorithm that you'd like to see more content like this and helps other people interested in the ancient world find this channel. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of the new Odyssey movie, or if there's anything about Homeric literature or Mycenaean Greece that you'd like me to touch on in a future video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.